take the fifth. Now we're going to shift our focus to the Fifth Amendment, due process and protecting the rights of the accused. Wow, this is a long one. The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That is a handful. The Fifth Amendment specifically is dealing with the rights of the accused. When it comes to the role of the grand jury is there to determine if there is enough evidence to go to a trial. Does the evidence that has been gathered by the executive warrant charging somebody with a crime and actually going through with the trial? Now, as you saw in the words of the Fifth Amendment, we are only going to use a grand jury for very serious crimes. We're talking about felonies, capital cases, the big ones. So when it comes to a misdemeanor, a person is not entitled to a grand jury. However, for much more significant and larger crimes, yes, an indictment by a grand jury is required in order for there to be a trial. Now, we use these words presentment or indictment. Now, what this means is a grand jury, a group of citizens, is presented with evidence from the prosecution, and they decide whether or not there's enough evidence to go ahead and charge them with a crime. But remember, just because somebody is indicted does not mean that they are guilty or that they're not guilty. All this means is that they can be charged with a crime, and the trial will determine the outcome. So a person can be indicted by a grand jury and still not be guilty. There are certain limitations, as I mentioned. These are for capital or otherwise infamous crimes. And it also does not apply to the military. Remember, the military is going to have its own judicial proceedings, and they have their own due process that they go through. So the military does not apply. And of course, the grand jury has not been incorporated to every single state. That is to say, some states will use grand juries for some potential crimes, but not always. And the reason for that is there are simply too many cases that are potentially there, and they don't have time to run through a grand jury for all of them. Oftentimes, when we think about the Fifth Amendment, we think about double jeopardy. This is a fun one. It says that a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. This protects us from a government that continually charges an individual with a crime and then recharges and recharges. And meanwhile, the person can either be incarcerated, arrested, and being held in jail until the crime, or just the regular hassle of an individual being targeted by the government. So basically, the government has one shot for a conviction, just one. And if a person is acquitted, that is to say found not guilty, then they cannot be charged for that crime again. There's a couple of exceptions, though. A person can be charged with a criminal act, but then later be sued in civil law. Remember, criminal law, if a person is convicted, they can go to prison and pay a fine to the government. In civil law, they are simply being sued for monetary damages for losses. An exception is state and federal law. A person can be charged for a state crime, and then if that crime also violates a federal law, they can then be charged with a federal crime. All Right? That is not considered double jeopardy because they are two different levels of government. Also, in the case of a hung jury, if a jury cannot reach a unanimous decision in a criminal case, then the jury is hung, and therefore the person was never actually in jeopardy of life or limb. And so, what that means is they can be retried. That does not violate the double jeopardy clause. And finally, appeals. Hey, if you are found guilty and you appeal your case, you are voiding your double jeopardy. You're not being charged again because it is the same. It's an extension of the same trial. Many people think that the Fifth Amendment is all about self-incrimination. I ain't got to say nothing. I've got my Fifth Amendment rights. Well, not so fast, my friend. A person cannot be forced to be a witness against himself during an investigation or during a trial. This protects us from being compelled to give evidence against ourselves about illegal activities. However, there are certain exceptions to this. You can be forced to testify against someone else. So if you are trying to look out for your BFF and say, well, I'm not going to testify, that's not protected under the Fifth Amendment because you are not offering evidence against yourself. You're offering evidence against somebody else, and you can be compelled to give that evidence. Also, if you're granted immunity in a trial, if you are not going to be charged and the prosecution grants you immunity from that, then you can be compelled to give evidence against yourself and others. DUI investigations is also another example of where we are compelled to give evidence against ourselves. If we are pulled over and suspected of driving under the influence, yes, an officer can force us, can compel us to either blow into the breathalyzer, and if we refuse to do that, go to the hospital and have a blood test. So we can be compelled to give incriminating evidence against ourselves when it comes to DUI. If we've been granted immunity, yes. Testifying against someone, yes. And of course, this is only applicable to illegal things, not necessarily embarrassing questions. This word is used a lot in when we're considering our rights. We call it due process of law. Due process basically means equal treatment under the law. Equal treatment under the law. That no man is above the law, no man is below the law. Everybody should be treated equally under the law. There are two types of due process you should be aware of. There is substantive due process. That is to say that the law itself must be fair. The law itself cannot be used to discriminate. It cannot treat one group of people differently from another. All right, so the law itself must be fair. We call that substantive due process. But at the same time, the due process must abide by procedural rules. So the procedure of carrying out an investigation, of prosecuting a case, of taking an individual's rights away, the procedure itself must also be equal treatment under the law, that we cannot process some more than others. It is very easy for us to identify and for the Supreme Court to throw out substantive due process violations. However, procedural is a far different case, and that is the root of what many of us see on a daily basis when it comes to our problems of policing in the United States. Now, due process has been extended to the states over the 14th Amendment, and so the requirement of due process of law is not just at the national level, it is also at the state level, and it is also at the local level. All Americans are entitled to due process of law from all levels of government. The last element in the Fifth Amendment is eminent domain. According to Article 1 of the Constitution, the government can take private property for public use. However, the Fifth Amendment protects us a little bit from that. Congress does have the authority to do this, and state and local governments also have this power of what's called eminent domain. However, the Fifth Amendment guarantees that every individual must be given just compensation for their loss. So yes, the government can take the property. However, they got to pay you for it. They have to give you market value for what your property is worth. And of course, it must be for the public good. Now, if a person wants to challenge the government and say, wait a minute, I don't think that you need to have my property, you can do that. All right, this challenge happens through the courts, and ultimately it is up to a judge to determine whether or not the government has this authority. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes the judge does side in favor with the homeowner, saying, nope, the government should not be taking your property. So it is not always a futile effort. Courts have the final say, and therefore we ultimately have checks and balances at work.